sitting across from me in our digital living room is George Saunders. George, thank you for joining us today.
Wait, something happened here, Tim. I'm sorry. My microphone got fucked up. Hold on.
That's okay.
Okay, we might have to do that over. I think I hit my cord. Now we're good, I think.
All right, great. So sitting across from me in our digital living room here during the pandemic is George Saunders. George, thank you for joining us on Experience Talks today.
Thank you for having me, Tim. Pleasure to be here.
So George Saunders is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of 10 books, including Lincoln and the Bardo, which won the Man Booker Prize, 10th of December, a finalist for the National Book Award, and the critically acclaimed short story collections CivilWarLand in Bad Decline, Pastoralia, and in Persuasion Nation. He teaches in the creative writing program at Syracuse University, and his most recent book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, is available now. George Saunders, welcome back to Experience Talks.
Good to be back.
So George, can you start us off by reading a little bit from the new book to give us an idea of what the new one is about?
Sure. This is an essay, a part of an essay in response to a beautiful Tolstoy story called Master and Man. And in that story, this guy, Vasily, it starts out as kind of a stinker. And then over the course of the story, he sort of maybe becomes something else. So this is passages kind of about, is that possible to change? And if it is, how does it actually happen on the ground? So to do that, I talked a little bit about an incident that happened to me a number of years ago, where I was coming out of Chicago and the plane started to go down apparently, and there was a great panic on board. Meanwhile, my plane kept dropping. The flight attendants and pilot had gone frighteningly silent. The familiar nighttime grid of Chicagoland continued to rush up. Then the passenger beside me, a kid of about 14, said in a scared, thin voice, "Sir, is this supposed to be happening?" My heart went out to him. What a phrase that is. My heart went out to him. It sounds like something extraordinary, but it is what our hearts are trying to do all the time. Go out to someone. Yes, it is, I lied. Reassuring him like that came naturally to me from years of parenting and teaching. Reassuring him, I felt myself coming back to myself. It's hard to explain. As the old Catholic hymn says, we must diminish and Christ increase. I spoke to that kid in the voice I'd always use when trying to persuade or cajole or calm someone because that was my habit. Responding to him in that voice with the familiar intention of calming, reassuring, and watching him respond, he seemed somewhat reassured or skeptical. It changed something in my body. Now my energy was going out toward him instead of inward neurotically. I was me again, and as myself, knew how to act. I was still scared, but had I died in that state, it would have been a better death than had I died in that earlier panicked condition. I think something like this is what happens to Vasily. He gets brought back to himself by acting like himself. As himself, he knows what to do. His natural energy, which for so long had been used to benefit only himself, gets redirected. A defect becomes a superpower. A bull about to run through a china shop gets turned in the direction of a home slated for demolition. And then, observing himself in action, seeing a charitable, selfless person, he is moved and feels a peculiar joy. A joy I associate with his relief at finally shucking off a way of being that has always impeded him. He recognizes this new version of himself, feels that strange and solemn tenderness, and starts to cry. And that is transformation.
Such a great thing. I mean, one, that story completely blew me away. I mean, it's just such an amazing story. And it reminded me how great Tolstoy is. And I think one of the things I love in the book is how you point out that Tolstoy wasn't necessarily the most poetic writer, but he was so incredible at bludgeoning you with the perfect facts. That idea of and his moral standing. It's amazing the way he can do that.
Yeah. And he you think of him as this big philosophical guy, which he is, but he builds that whole philosophical universe just out of simple, objective facts. And he's got this amazing power to notice things that we all notice, but we don't notice that we notice them. And he drops them in, and suddenly, that's really the kind of primary glue of fiction. Is if I say something, and you go, "Oh yeah, that is like that," or "Oh, that did happen to me," then I got you, and then I can take you on this, or he can take you on this crazy journey that he does.
So talk a bit about what inspired you to write this book now. It could be called a book about writing. I think it's a lot more than that, obviously. But what inspired you to do a book like this now?
Yeah, my whole so-called career, it's always been kind of ad hoc, and just I tend to just go toward what excites me, because that's turned out to be the best path for me. But in this case, I had been touring for this Lincoln and the Bardo for a pretty long time. It kind of got out of control. And then I finally got back to teaching. And there was just one afternoon after a good class where it kind of hit me what a big thing teaching had been for me in my life. I think I'd often thought of it as my job, and yeah, I'm pretty good at it. But after that class, I just thought, oh my God, this has sustained me so much over the years, to be in a room full of young people. And if you get lucky, something happens where the room kind of melds into one person, and then you all leave kind of buzzed, and happy. So I thought, oh, that's really something that only at this late stage in my life did I realize what a blessing I'd had all these years. And so I've been teaching this Russian class on and off for 20 years, and it was always the best thing I taught. It was always the most lively class. So I thought, I've got all these notes, and I've got all these insights, some of which are mine, but most of which are my students, and the accumulation. And I just had that kind of, 60-something thought, like, oh, that'd be kind of sad if that just, when I died, was still just this little red notebook in my drawer, So I mentioned it to my wife, Paula, and I mentioned it to my editor, and they thought, oh, that'd be good. So I just really did it in a way to kind of get ready for the next, real book of fiction. But I think part of me knew, too, that it was a time for recharge a little bit, like time to kind of, sort of step in and go back to the wellspring a little bit and see if why I started becoming a writer in the first place, and see if that energy was still alive in me.
So I want to talk about that. I want to get back to a Swim Upon in the Rain in a minute, but I want to talk to you about your wellspring, your formation story as a writer. One of the things that struck me in the beginning of the book was how reading Steinbeck in Texas as a young man connected with you. Can you talk from the point of view of a reader first, before you were a writer, and talk about what connecting with a piece of fiction meant?
Sure. I mean, I was kind of from a sort of a semi-working class part of Chicago, and my real interest was music, and I was a good reader, but I had sort of a long gap as a reader all through grade school and high school. I didn't really read for fun, or I read kind of a light nonfiction. And then when I got to Texas, I was working in the oil fields for one summer. And our family was having we had a restaurant that burned down. So we were having some struggles there. Nothing dramatic, but you noticed it. And then I was working in the oil fields every day. It was one of these legendarily hot summers. And I was working with a lot of people who were older who'd had some trouble. There were a guy just out of jail, and some vets, and some people with addiction issues. And I just read Steinbeck, read The Grapes of Wrath, and it made that connection. The first time it ever happened where I connected my actual life with a fictive representation of life. And it just kind of threw open all these political doors in my head. Well, that's why socialism is appealing, because of this summer, And so I think my road into writing and reading was always very kind of moral, ethical, and very pragmatic. So I was a big Khalil Gibran fan. I was a big Robert Pirsig, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Ayn Rand was an early crush of mine. So I always understood fiction to be something that was supposed to help you contextualize your actual life, and hopefully, make it better. That was I took that as a given. So Steinbeck was the first kind of major writer who was actually a truly literary writer who I felt worked on that basis. And I think the Russians are the same for me. I read them shortly after, and they were the same. They seemed to be really not screwing around here. They were talking about the stuff that kept you awake at night and worried you and so on.
Can you talk about your becoming a writer? I know that your path wasn't exactly the straightest line between 2 points, and you might be the only writer that I know that monkeys played an important part in in your formation story as a writer. So what happened?
Yes, monkeys were my teachers. Well, I went to an engineering school and I got a degree in geophysics, and the reason I wanted to do that was because it would get me out of America and let me travel. So I went to Asia, did field seismography in the jungle in Sumatra, which is really everything I had hoped for, very adventurous and crazy. And then, but a lot of these things I did them partly because they looked like good writerly Vita material, you know, that it seemed like something that a writer would do. And then, but I was writing a little bit, but I wasn't reading enough. That was my real downfall. I wasn't reading contemporary work at all. But so then one day I think I had a girlfriend back in the States who broke up with me. And at that time we were working 4 weeks on and 2 weeks off. So the vacation came and I resolved to fly to Denver and win her back. So I was waiting at this river outlet for a ferry boat to come, and I went for a swim in the river there. And, I'm kind of happily enjoying my melodramatic moment. And I look up and there's like 1,000, now probably 300 monkeys on the pipeline pooping down into the water. And I just thought, I wonder if that's okay, and it wasn't. So I got really sick, and I was probably 23 at that point. And I got sick in a way that at the time I felt it was an advanced look at what it would be like to be 90 and faltering, because I was so weak, and I had to sleep 14, 15 hours a day, or I felt terrible the next day. So that did two things. One is it basically got me to quit that job because I was suffering so much that I couldn't bear it. But also it kind of just opened me up to loss, I guess, or vulnerability, or to be that young and be getting that beat up by life was really good for me. It burned away a lot of arrogance. And I think it made me a little more curious to other people and made me more convinced that their pain was real. Before that, I think I had sort of that Ayn Rand idea that pain meant that you were weak somehow, or you were deficient, or maybe even at some level you were being punished or something. After this, I'm like, oh no, okay, so pain is what we have in common, and we just aren't feeling it right now by good fortune. That really rewires your thinking. So then I it's kind of a long, boring story, but I kind of very slowly made my way back to writing and ended up in Syracuse at the creative writing program.
In a review of your first story collection, CivilWarLand in Bad Decline, Michiko Kakatani wrote that you write like the illegitimate offspring of Nathaniel West and Kurt Vonnegut. You've been compared to Vonnegut quite often, and you've written about you when you first read Slaughterhouse-Five in one of your essays. Can you talk about how Vonnegut affected you in your work?
Well, the first thing was when I read him in Asia, I didn't really get it. I was very much a big, like what do they call it? Like a kind of a, I don't know. I was a stingy young man. I liked classics to sound like classics, and I liked exalted language, and a sense of humor was suspicious, and so I picked up Slaughterhouse-Five thinking, it's a World War II book, it'll be like Hemingway. And when it was so funny and so irreverent, and when there were aliens in it, I was just like, oh, no, too bad. He went to the war and he didn't use it correctly. And then only later, when I got wiser, I saw what a beautiful book that is, and how he's absolutely doing those things because it's the quickest path to the truth that he has to offer us. And his truth is actually more profound than Hemingway's in my view. But that took me a long time to accept humor. I use it every day in real life. It was totally my power and also my defense mechanism. But somehow, as a working class person, I thought, well, literature is that thing that allows you to disavow everything you actually do and just be this kind of pure creature made entirely of light, And so the result of that was a very, very boring, humor-free prose coming out of a person who didn't really know how to think any other way but humorously. And so I think Vonnegut, it was one of a few writers that were like my pathway back. When I read him again later, like, oh, of course that's beautiful. It's just beautiful in a more complicated way than I could have understood at 20, 22 or 23.
I love the way you talk. You wrote an essay, Mr. Vonnegut in Sumatra, and there was in your collection, the Braindead Megaphone. You talk about reading that earlier today, almost 40 years after it was written, and in the middle of another war. I sat in my kitchen reading Slaughterhouse-Five. The book didn't stop the current war and won't stop the next one or the one after that. but something in me rose to the truth in it, and I was put in proper relation to the war going on now. I was, if you will, forbidden to misunderstand it. I just think that's such a great way to describe how a great writer can make us understand something as impossible to understand as war.
Yeah, and it's all, something that runs through the Russians is this idea that writing fiction doesn't actually have to solve a problem, but as Chekhov said, it just has to formulate it correctly. And I think sometimes in this age that we're in now, which is a lot of quick takes and a lot of social media and a lot of sort of opining, constant opining, we forget how refreshing it is actually to just sit on a difficult truth and go, I really don't know the answer to that one, but that's a good question. That's actually really a very mature moral move to be able to say, I'll have to get back to you on that because I don't know, And in my case, what it does is it lengthens the time during which additional data is coming in. If you don't decide today, that means you're still an open conduit for any other perhaps contradictory facts. That elevates the whole thing. Even if you still remain inactive, or when you do finally take action, you're taking action from a place that's got more complexity in it, and the action will be sort of automatically more merciful, and I think also more efficient in the end. So in that way, fiction can be kind of seen as a way of I always think of it as there's me, judgmental George walking around, and Chekhov comes in with a cudgel and goes bonk, and suddenly you're destabilized in your judging, which leaves you, I would say, a little bit better. What's the rush to judge?
Yeah. So let's get back to the Russians. Why did you choose the Russians as the focus of the course at Syracuse and this book? What is it about the Russians that made you go there?
Yeah, in truth, it was very, very pragmatic. I had been working as an engineer, and I got this chance to. I'm getting something that the volume is hard. Hold on just a second. I don't know why. Sorry, I'm going to try to turn my volume up, but I don't quite know how to do it. Let me plug this mic in here. I just got a couple texts that the volume is too low.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. Is that any better? Anybody? See who that was, who chatted us here. Raymond, is that any better? Or Gene Fisher, is that any better?
All right, we got a yes. Yeah,
oh, yes.
We got it.
Okay,
yeah.
good. And now,
Great.
Tim, I can't
Thanks,
hear you
George.
for some reason.
Tim,
I somehow, 1 second, I got to do one other thing here. Hold on, sorry.
It's all right.
Okay, now I think. Okay, apologies for that technical interruption, but thank you for letting us know.
Interviews in the time of the pandemic.
Yeah, we got to all do our part. So the Russians, what happened was I was working as an engineer, and I got an offer to come teach at Syracuse, and I interviewed for it, accepted it, and then they told me that I would teach a workshop, which I was comfortable with, but also a forms class to 20 or 30 MFA writers. And the idea was you're teaching literature for writers. So we had to pick a body of literature and then talk about it technically, which was terrifying to me at that point. I'd never taught grad students before. So I'd been reading some Tolstoy short stories, and I always loved Chekhov. So I thought I'll just do those. I think half the syllabus I hadn't read. I just picked the stories out of the blue, and so that was just luck, really. And then the reason I wrote the book about it was just that over the years, those writers had been so completely teachable. They just were, these stories were great to use as a springboard to talk about craft issues. And I think partly because they're so old, it means that all the fog of the contemporary is gone. There's no cell phones, and there's no current political issues. They're all long dead political issues. It's all like, sleds and samovars and that. So in a way that it's almost like watching a silent film. You don't get distracted by the merely contemporary, and you can look at the real core of it and the real spine of it.
Can you talk a little bit about the core concepts, or a few of them that you teach in the book and in the course? What is it that we should look for that makes a story great? How do these great writers use those tools?
Right. Well, I mean, the biggest thing I think the book is about is just the fact that when we look at a story or a song or a poem or a house for that matter, there's kind of a little process there. One is the thing comes in to us, we receive it. Then there's almost an automatic, spontaneous, undeniable reaction that we have to it. If we're pretty educated, if we've read some stories before, then a really critical point is to accept that reaction, you know. Now, what I used to do when I was younger and not so well educated in reading stories was I would override my actual reaction because it didn't sound very literary. And I would, you know, try to graft on somebody else's reaction that sounded smarter. That's falsification. And there's nowhere to go with that. You know, all right. So a really big step is to accept your actual reaction. Then you try to articulate that when you're in an analysis phase. Can you actually say what you felt? Can you describe it? And then the biggest thing is you try to weave that that little pattern of response, of reaction and response into the bigger meaning of the story. So if you're crying on page 8, why? There's a reason, you know. And the idea is you can, you know. So that's one thing, just to say to the reader, especially if the reader is a prospective writer, you have to trust those reactions. And the real journey of a career is to get better at detecting the really quiet ones. You know, the ones that maybe when you were in your 20s, you didn't know that you liked that. You didn't know that you disliked that. But to start listening to your own judgment and trusting it is a big thing. Then beyond that, I make the case that because the story is such a specific, weird little form, you know, 9 pages with a beginning and a middle and end, that we're kind of, we're going to value causality. We want A to cause B. We get a thrill when that happens. We're going to value efficiency. In a 9-page story, there's not too much room for a 5-page goiter, you know, really. We're also going to value specificity in image. You know, if you say some people were somewhere, that's not so good. But if you say, you know, there were 4 Presbyterians in a storm cellar, suddenly you're onto something. So none of these are general principles, or they're certainly not laws. They're kind of like an attempt to discover rules, meaning how do things tend to work when someone's reading a story. And of course, the biggest thing is for the writer to read a story and see what's pulling her into it. Like, you know, I do an exercise at Syracuse where I hand out 5 paragraphs from a literary magazine, and I've just crossed out the writer's name. So it's the 5 first paragraphs of 5 stories. And I just say, okay, now rank these, and I leave the room. But I don't say on what basis, but because they're all language wonks, they're right hard at work, you know. Then I come back in and we put the rankings on the board. They never agree, ever, you know. But then comes a critical place where I say, okay, now tell me why. You know, why is that number 1 for you? When did this one start to sour and become number 5? And that, I would say, in that is almost everything, you know, because we do have those insane micro preferences. And part of the idea of being an artist is that we just celebrate them, you know, we get behind them. And the beauty is you don't have to defend them. You just have to recognize them and then use them. So that's kind of the book in a nutshell, I guess. But the idea is we'd use these Russian stories to get there a little more naturally than.
Great. I mean, it's interesting to me too, because there is a timelessness about the writing. I mean, we talked about Tolstoy and his laser focus on using facts to move the story along. And there is a sense with his writing. Like you inspired me to reread Anna Karenina. And the first line of Anna Karenina: happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. That's the first line of Anna Karenina. And it sounds like it could be an article from Cosmopolitan last month. I mean, it's just so unbelievably truthful and right now. And the whole book, you know, I mean, it is about a different political landscape and time, but so much of it feels like it could be applied to what's going on right now.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, you know, that as I understand it, people in his time took some issue with that book because the, you know, the kind of feeling of that book is that adultery would never be accepted in Russia. But in fact, it was. There were all kinds of situations like hers going on. So even in the most realistic book, there's a kind of a make-believe, almost cartoonish quality that really rarefies this experience of being alive and reduces it almost to stick figures. And for some reason, we like that. We like to see our experience shrunk down a little bit and simplified. And I think it helps us go back out into the actual mess and, you know, figure out what to do.
Yeah. I really enjoy the afterthoughts sections. I mean, I like the structure of the book is really cool. It's story analysis of the story, or kind of discussion of the story, and then there's these afterthoughts sections of the book. Can you talk about why you wrote those and what you were trying to get to with those? They were all so different and so interesting about what you were thinking about the stories.
Yeah, one of the challenges of the book was to see, I really wanted to mostly just write about the Russians. I didn't really want to write about my process if I could help it. But then whenever I'd write about the Russians, there'd always be a little leftover something that seemed to me would be helpful. And so over the many, many drafts, the structure became clear. And I think what I was trying to do a little bit is, there's an implicit problem when you're talking about writing and using examples, is that the young writer should be asking, well, okay, but why is this good for me? Like if I analyze Tolstoy or Chekhov, what does that do for me as a writer? And because it's clear that you're not just stealing the tricks, you're not just going, oh, I'll do an exact copy of The Darling or something like that. So in the class, there's always one session where somebody raises their hand and says, wait a minute, just tell me something. I'm analyzing these stories. How does it help me? Those afterthoughts were kind of my attempt to explain the ways in which analyzing the stories might be helpful. And often I was using my own writing practice as an example. And also the question that hangs over the book that I don't really answer is, if I say that Chekhov used technique X, and I demonstrate it and I prove to you that he did, we still don't know anything about how he came to do that. That's the kind of a mysterious box that we can't get into. How does a writer know how to be brilliant? That you sort of have to leave alone a little bit,
Yeah, and obviously there's different forms of brilliance too between the different writers. Yes. The four writers are very, very different than each other.
Yes, and also from teaching, some people like me, I don't like any outlining. I say, I like just spontaneous interaction with the text over and over again. Other people whose writing I love say, no, I outline everything. So it's important to remember that there is just not a method. There are methods, and then for each writer, there's the method that works for her. Humility is an important thing
it's in everything. So you talk in the introduction of the book about us living now in a degraded era. How can great fiction, great literature battle against what we are facing in times like these?
Yeah.
Can it give us hope in times like this?
I think it can. But I think ironically, to do it, you have to kind of say, well, it might not. I don't know. You have to be a little bit. I think I find myself having to remind myself not to be too sure about what it does or how it does it. In my experience, what it does is it just one, it reminds you that everybody else out there is as real as you are. That those actually are real people running around out there in those jackets and ties. But I think what it does is it engages, if you're going to make the argument for what it does, I think we start with, well, what happened to you the last time you read a book, a great book. And, we can learn a lot just by watching our own minds. Like you start to read the Chekhov story, you're in one state, you're done with it, you're in another state. Really, that's the whole game. There's some alteration of the mind from page 1 to page 9. I think there is some argument to be made for the idea that reading stories is like it's a little bit of light training in empathy. In other words, when you're reading a story, you're starting with a rough projection of a person, and then the writer is guiding you through those 9 or 10 pages to obtain a more nuanced version of that person. That's a good thing to be able to do in life. You're walking down the street, somebody walks by you, you know who they are by their appearance and their bearing, but really you don't know anything. So in fiction, you get to turn on your heel, and Chekhov throws you into that person's head for 9 pages, and you're kind of him for 9 pages. And even if he turns out to be kind of a jerk, well, he's a more particular jerk. So I think there's some argument for that. But again, I think for me, I always go back to this basic experiences. I read 6 pages of Toni Morrison, or 6 pages of Gogol, or 6 pages of Isaac Babel, or Grace Paley, and I just try to see what the difference is from beginning to end. And really, that's the ultimate answer.
I love the way you talk about your readers and readers in general too. You talk about the fact that you meet a lot of dedicated readers and lovers of literature, and you describe people's passion for literature as a vast underground network of goodness at work in the world. I think there is something to be said about the fact that readers have greater empathy and greater understanding. I think that's where that goes.
I think they also, yes, and they also have, if I could say so, I think they have disproportionate influence in the world. You know, one of the blessings of being published is you get to go out and do these readings. And so, you know, you do your talk, and then there's the book signing line. And it's really an amazing opportunity to see just who those people are, you know. And it's quick, and it's very, you know, it's rushed. But it's amazing the extraordinary people that I've met in those lines who are doing sometimes very quietly incredible things for their community. And you think, well, okay, so if a book doesn't have the number of buyers that a TV show or a movie does or whatever, it falls on people who are really primed to take it into themselves and to be transformed by it. So the tours for 10th of December in Lincoln were really big, and I met probably tens of thousands of people. And that was the biggest takeaway for me, is when I went back to write, I had a new confidence that I could aim high, and that there were people out there who would be there to receive it. And that's much different than when you're young. Your projection is maybe that they're out to get you, or they don't care, or, you know, and so it was very powerful to have that opportunity.
That's fantastic. I know you're a musician, and one of my favorite things that you write about is music. I'm indescribable level music fan, and I love the stuff that you do in the New York Times Magazine in their music edition. You turned me on to post drive-by truckers Jason Isbell a couple of years ago. The year before that, you turned me on to, I've always been a big Wilco fan. I was not completely aware of the song One Sunday Morning, and reading those articles about those songs really opened my mind. Can you talk about music and songs and songwriting and what that means to you?
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the one that got away. You know, it was my first, the first artists that I really admired were musicians, or maybe Monty Python a little before that. But, I thought it was just wonderful, and I was a pretty fluent guitar player from early age, like in a rock, rock guitars. But somehow it's interesting, when I got to the place where I should have naturally known how to make a life in that form, something froze up. When I'm writing songs, I never have written one that I really like. I get to a certain point, and I would say that my opinion manufacturer goes a little weak. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I could do it any number of ways. That never happened to me when I'm writing prose. I have a really crazily strong impulse. So that makes me think that, in some ways it's certainly not our choice which art form we follow. I think we have to see, like Flannery O'Connor says about fiction, a person can choose what he writes, but he can't choose what he makes live. So for me, I can't really make a song live, and I never have been able to. So it's sad and a little bit humbling, but it also really makes me excited to go write, because there the opinions are strong. And I think it also makes me a better teacher, because, you realize when you try an art form that maybe isn't your natural art form, it teaches you a kind of humility, and that there are lots of different paths to the kingdom, or to the mansion or whatever. There's a lot of different ways of getting there, and just because it seems a certain way to you doesn't mean it's going to seem that way for your students. But I love music so much. I tell you, I just got a Gibson SG for my birthday, so now I'm full of hope again.
It's a great guitar. So to stay on music for a minute, can we talk about Jason Isbell just for a minute? Because I know you know him and you've interviewed him, and the last concert I saw before the pandemic closed the door on live music was Jason Isbell and his wife Amanda Shears doing an acoustic concert at the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, and probably one of the most amazing shows I've ever seen. I don't think they had done Only Children live off of Reunions yet, so it was the first time I'd heard that song. How do you write songs like that guy writes? I got no concept of how a song like that is birthed.
I don't either. And I talked to him about it. We recorded an interview, and I think that songs, to me, they seem like a different species of bird than stories, because I think a lot of them come out pretty much right away, which I don't get, the thing that the thing I retain in my memory about that talk with Jason was, somehow somebody had said, "Oh, you guys can play together," and I'm like, "Yeah." And there were two guitars there, and right away I just chicken shitted out of it. There's no way I'm playing. So that was a great relief to me that I said that. But then just as we were all done, we had a very nice conversation, amazing. And then we were leaving, and he just sort of absent-mindedly almost picked up this guitar. I think it was a Martin, and he just played a little something, and it was it was so loud. He was just playing with a pick, and it filled the room, and it was so fast, and it was so precise. I said it was almost like having a nice talk with Michael Jordan, and then as you're leaving, he dunks over your head, So it really taught me something about how natural these musicians are, how it's really like breathing for them in a way that for the rest of us mortals, it probably isn't. But he's got a beautiful songwriting style and a beautiful, inquisitive mind about everything, and he's just an incredible musician.
Yeah, very truthful. So a few years ago, you gave the Convocation Speech at the University of Syracuse, where you teach, and it went viral on the internet. And you talked to graduating college seniors about kind of walking the path into the world, and you talked about some advice that you would give them and some regrets that you might have. Can you talk about that speech? My friend Greg and I talked about how we should just wake up every day and listen to that speech. Can you talk about what you told those lucky people in that audience?
Yeah, well, it was kind of funny because I was doing it sort of as a favor to the university. They asked me to speech at this. It wasn't even the graduation; it was the convocation. And it was going to be in the dome, and it was going to be hot, and to a crowd of people who wanted you to get off quickly. So I had a speech. I'd given a version of that speech to my daughter's 6th grade class a few years before, and it was very successful. So I thought, okay, I don't have to worry about it. I'll just grab it and do that. Well, then I couldn't find it. I still haven't found it. So I kind of redid it from memory, and really, for me, the gist of it was I am not in a position to give a graduation speech. I don't know. My life has been all over the place. But the one advantage I do have is that I'm old. If I look back very honestly in the rearview mirror, I actually don't regret anything, except I do regret the handful of times when I could have handled something with kindness, and instead my natural anxiety or ego got in the way. And I never have been, I've never burned anybody's crops or bombed their ancestral village, but I have failed to act in certain moments when it would have been really wonderfully heroic to have acted. And so I told a story about this one girl in our class, that was sort of she was being treated badly, and I just sort of went, and then didn't do anything, So that was the gist of it. And really the back idea is that kindness, or the aspiration to kindness, is such a big part of everybody's life every day that I know. I mean, there's nobody who goes out in the morning saying, I'm going to kick some ass. They're mostly people, and yet there's not really an within the intellectual tradition, there's not really a way to talk about that honorably. Now, in other cultures, like in Eastern cultures, there really is. They recognize that kindness is an actual thing that you can get better at. And they also spend a lot of time asking what it is exactly. It's not nice being nice only. It's not always smiling or never objecting. It's something more complicated. So you make a talk like that, and it did go. But the funny thing was, though, the day I made it, it was a big nothing. I made the speech, feeling pretty good about it, walked out into this huge crowd, and I was literally like trolling around the after party, waiting for somebody to say it was good, and went home empty-handed. And then it went viral later, So that was nice. But then it does lead you to talk about it more. And I published that in the book, and then it leads you to think, well, so what is kindness actually? And the great blessing of thinking about kindness is it leads you to a lot of other things. Like if, for example, if you were in a coffee shop and you noticed that the barista had been crying, and you made the resolution that morning to be kind, okay, what do you do? Well, it's hard to say. Maybe it'd be better just to shut up and leave her alone, or maybe you should try to engage. What don't you know that would tell you what to do? Then you get into the realm of awareness. And then you get into the realm of what am I usually inclined to do? Like I have a little bit of a good guy complex, so I would be more inclined to try to intervene than not. even if that might make it worse, So I think thinking about kindness is an interesting way to get into a whole lot of other rooms that are important,
Yeah,
awareness and all that kind of stuff.
it's great. You and I are right around the same age, and this show is called Experience Talks, partly because our organization believes that aging ain't such a bad idea. As there are some really good things about getting older. And one other thing that you said in the Syracuse speech was most people, as they age, become less selfish and more loving. Can you talk about the fact that as we get older, we actually might get kinder, better to each other?
Well, that was one of the lines that I caught some crap for over the years because people was like, my husband? So yeah, I guess I would say if we're lucky as we get older, we get kinder. And I think it's, just that you kind of wear out on the things that would make you unkind. You sort of see the limitations of ego, you see the limitations of accomplishment, you see the limitations of fighting, and I just think your energy goes down, when your energy, like when you're tired or sick, you're not picking a fight with anybody. And I think also you're sensitized to suffering, like when I was in Asia, you get sick and suddenly you see, oh, everybody's a little sick, or you get depressed and you're like, oh yeah, actually everybody's a little depressed or could be. So I think that's what happened. But of course, the other side of that is you get raw wounds. You're disappointed in the same way over and over. That might make you bitter, or you have some assumption that you start with when you're young that's wrong about your own primacy in the world, maybe, or the way things should be. And when the world continues to refuse to yield to you, that could lead you to bitterness. So I think actually the way I would write that now is that there's a crossroads moment, and something about the way you are determines whether you're going to age with grace and increased bandwidth, or if you're going to harden with the way that sometimes people certainly do.
Yeah. You've had an interesting few years as a writer. Your last three books have been very different, obviously. 10th of December, a book of short stories, which you've primarily known for and have done a lot of. Lincoln in the Bardo, which was your first novel, which you also happened to win the Man Booker Prize for. And this one, in which four Russians give a master class on writing, reading, and life, which I love. It's the greatest tagline of all time. So what's next? What's next for you? What's the next book that we can look forward to?
I think it'll be another collection of stories. I've been working on them all along, and that's kind of my default. I kind of, that's what I'm doing all the time is writing stories. That's the next one. And then I guess the challenge of each book is to try to not double back over the same path. So hopefully these will be different enough from the ones in 10th of December that they'll be different, but also an advance in some way. And I have I owe Random House another book after that, and we'll see what happens. But for me, it's not so much. I think my sort of interest right now is I don't really care what form it takes, but I want to continue to investigate. I don't know how to say it. I was going to say positive phenomenon, but what I really mean is I'm pretty good at satirizing, and I love to dwell in like dark conjectural spaces and stuff. But I'm also have been really lucky in my life, and so I'm noticing as a sort of a technical issue in my work is that it's really happy to be dark. It's not so comfortable being more, let's say, positive, and that is fundamentally a technical problem. It's more difficult to praise, actually. To praise with precision is one of the hardest things to do. And the great writers like Tolstoy and Edith Wharton, for example, the Brontes, they can do that. They can praise with precision. So I'm kind of in a mad dash to try to both develop myself personally so I have access to that polarity, but also develop myself technically so that I can get at it when I need it. So that's whether it's a nonfiction or poems or a novel, I don't really care, but I want to see if I can properly weight maybe the good and the evil in the world in a way that's correct.
You mentioned earlier that humor tends to be a defense mechanism for you. Maybe the darkness is too. Right? It seems like you're trying to get more to your true self, right?
Yeah, and also it's complicated because those are both very defensive and very comfortable, but they're also pretty authentic to me. So I think that's one of the tricky parts of it is you have to take the energy that you have naturally And then I think the trick is to not misunderstand it. So, for example, I have a certain energy which early on in my career got tagged as satire. Okay, but that's not exactly accurate. So the trick is to keep the energy, which I mean, as we talked about at the beginning with Master and Man, you're not going to manufacture some entirely new self, some entirely new energy. You got to kind of come with that brought you, you know. But you can, I think, maybe re-understand your primary energy and redirect it slightly. So, for example, what I always thought was a dark comedy. Well, okay, we might understand that as comedy, you know, or we might understand it as wit, or at the highest levels, you might understand it as presence, you know. When someone's able to be funny in a situation, she's really there, you know, she has to be there to know how to convert that moment into humor. So I do a lot of thinking about that. Like, there's nothing carved in stone about us as individuals. You know, we're this kind of beautiful energy burst that started back for me in 1958. Um, and we constantly identify it and categorize it, but in fact, it's uncategorizable, and it's there for us to use. So the path of the artist, I think, is to sort of basically accept all the complicated shit that you are, but also not cave in too quickly to the labeling that you did when you were young. You know, to sort of say, I'm still here. I can still discover things about myself I didn't know.
I want to ask you kind of a neo-political question. You know, we obviously we're in a kinder, gentler place today than we were a month or two ago, obviously, in terms of our political outlook. We've talked about the idea that potentially art, literature, music, all of those things can make us more empathetic. You've talked about kindness. Is there a way to get us to come together after what we've been through? We're so divided as a country, and the divide just seems to be at times unbridgeable. Is there a way for us that we can find a way to listen to each other and find some common ground again?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, I want to be a little bit careful and say it might not be. I think that, you know, that has certainly happened in the history of the world, you know. I'm edging my way back to something, and it's kind of like this. I'll start with a little thought experiment. Let's say that you took 10,000 Americans and led them into a baseball stadium, and you sent out a memo saying, if you're a Republican, wear a red shirt. If you're a Democrat, wear blue. Okay, we all get situated. Somebody brings a podium to second base and gives an inflammatory speech about immigration from one side or the other, it doesn't matter. Pretty soon you're going to have fistfights. Given the way the world is right now, you're going to. Okay, that's bad. Now, could you say, okay, everybody calm down, let's discuss this? I kind of think not. I think the fights are going to keep going. All right, now, rewind. You can dress however you want. You go in the stadium, and suddenly the Yankees and the Red Sox run out. You know, in that moment, suddenly there's all kinds of new allegiances being made. You know, this conservative Red Sox fan and this liberal Red Sox fan are suddenly buddies. Also, the tone changes. You know, suddenly people are kind of joking, and there's a little bit of antipathy because it's the Red Sox and the Yankees. But basically, we know how to behave at a baseball game. So that's been on my mind, and I can't really do the next step in analyzing it. But I think I would add to it this: we seem to understand politics as a handful of preformed opinions about a handful of issues. So immigration is one, cancel culture, Trump is now one, and by this time we can all do both sides of the conversation. We know it so well. It's coming to us from somewhere. It's not really originating in our own minds. It's certainly not originating fully in our own experience. We're kind of being programmed by people from far away to say, here's what constitutes our politics, and here's what the two sides feel about it. That's a trap. Now, it's totally defensible, and I understand it. And there are people being hurt by in my view, the right-wing politics. But somehow that's one of those thumb traps. You know, you're not going to be able to reason our way out of that. So I think what I'm trying to do, just on a local level, the friends that I have who are Trump supporters, I'm just trying to think of them as my friends again. Yeah. And I'm literally giving a free pass for a while. Not for, I mean, this is not like We don't rewind to the beginning, but to say for a while, I'm going to try to remember what I love about you, and I'm going to let you remember what you love about me, and maybe that axis will change. And instead of talking about immigration, we'll talk about some different issues that aren't as agitating. And for one more generalization in this long string of them, it seems to me that those things have to be local.
Yeah.
When I did those Trump rallies, I talked to so many Trump supporters who were red hot about immigration. And when you said to them, tell me about your negative experience with an undocumented person, they didn't have anything.
Yeah.
They didn't have any actual experience. They had sometimes some anecdotal ones that were interesting. Mostly they had what they got from TV. So that tells me that we could maybe find a space where if we really concentrated on local things, how could your life be improved by your government? We might find there's more commonality than we think. But having said all that, I'm not that optimistic. I think there's a crazy momentum going on, and there's a crazy force multiplier, which is social media, which is this kind of weird thing that we really have not had in our lives before. And I think it's starting to show indications that it's pretty toxic.
Yeah. I think it seems to me like we just have to find some way to almost litigate the truth. We've gotten to a place where the truth is just whatever anybody wants to say anytime they say it.
Yeah. And that's why, to come back around, I think fiction, it sounds a little bit Pollyannish, but fiction has a place to play in that, because when I'm telling you a story that I'm making up, how do I keep you in it? Well, I keep you in it by saying a series of things that seem true to you. If I say, Tim walked across the freshly cut summer grass, which smelled like benzene and pancakes, you go, wait a minute. No, I don't think, I'm not with you. George, I'm not with you. If I rewind and I make I say something that makes you truly remember childhood's crossing cut grass, then we're a union again. So I think in the realm of the made up, it's only the ultimate truth that keeps the game going, So,
yeah. There's a part in the end of the book. Is it okay? Can I read a part of your book?
Please. Yeah.
Yeah,
you paid for it.
Exactly. The last part of the book is called "We End," and there's a part that talks about exactly what you were just saying that I love. There are many versions of you in you. To which one am I speaking when I write? The best one, the one most like my best one. Those two best versions of us, in a moment of reading, exit our usual selves and at a location created by mutual respect, become one. That's a pretty hopeful model of human interaction. Two people, mutually respectful, leaning in, one speaking so as to compel, the other listening, willing to be charmed. That a person can work with. And I just think that, to me, kind of sums it up. The idea that I think we have to kind of shoot for our higher selves. We have to be our higher, better selves.
Yeah. And I think that's part of what art does. For me, it does. It's like a sacramental function where, if you're reading a beautiful story and you find yourself moved, and you're in an altered space, and when, sometimes you come out of a work of art and you're just like, oh, this dear world, it's so lovely and complicated, and you see a person and you're slightly more interested in finding out who they are. Just those little incremental effects. Okay, so if that happens to you, I'd say that's what I'm calling a better you, and of course it recedes. It doesn't last all night, but if you, in the same way that, when I was a kid, I used to go to mass, and I really enjoyed it, and would come out of the mass feeling like a bigger person, somehow connected to Jesus and kind of more compassionate. So in the same way, if you have one experience where you're altered, that proves a really interesting thing, which is you can be altered. You're not just stuck in who you are. You actually are an alterable being. And beyond that, if we can find ways to consistently alter ourselves in a positive way, that's a really powerful thing. That in itself is a huge thing. Art is one of them. For me, meditation is another. Listening to music is one. Those are hopeful just because whatever situation we find ourselves in, we're not stuck, actually. We're mutable. So to me, art is just a way of reminding ourselves that we're mutable, maybe.
Yeah. And Inauguration Day for me was a day filled with moments like that. We had a 22-year-old poet from Los Angeles stand up and steal the show. You know, that, I mean, the singers that, you know, that there's that feeling that we can rise to a better place is so great. That I teared up so many times during that day, because I just thought, this is who we're supposed to be. This is what we're supposed to look like.
Yeah. And the challenge of that is that there were, you know, I know some people who watched that and were not moved, you know?
Yeah.
So then that's where it gets really tricky, you know, and really,
yeah.
I actually, you know, I covered the Trump rallies back in 2016. And the one thing I learned to do sometimes, if I can remember it, is just to say, I don't know. You know, like the human mind always wants to have an opinion and be sure. But in this stuff, I'm trying to train myself just to kind of go, okay, you don't know. You don't. And that, again, that's a way of letting more data come in, I guess, you know, but it's really, it's a scary time, a very, very sobering time, I think.
Yeah, yep, I agree. Well, George, thank you so much for being on the show. Everyone should read this book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. Fantastic book by George Saunders. George, I really appreciate you coming on Experience Talks. I always enjoy your perspective on everything.
Well, likewise, I love talking to you, and I hope everything goes well from here on in, and we meet in real life someday soon.
Exactly. One of those book tours, I'll be there. Thanks, George. Much appreciated.
Excellent.
All right. Talk to you
soon.
soon.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Thanks for being here.